Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
You know, I've got a really special guest today for this week's podcast. And the special guest is somebody that I learned an awful lot about, not only wildlife conservation, but about how the world works and how things work in the wildlife and the outdoor community, especially the communications world. And I guess without a whole lot more to go on here, I'll just introduce him. It's my father, Tom Opre. We both have the same first name, I get this straight, different middle names. I'll have to ask my dad someday why he did that to me.
I'll be happy to tell you that.
But my father, and I'll give a quick intro here, my father, you know, he's the reason why I got in the film business and in the outdoor communications industry, you know, as a whole. My father wrote for a newspaper, the Detroit Free Press, that at one time was one of the largest newspapers, daily newspapers in the United States, if not the world. And he was the outdoor editor of it, which entailed, I think, writing a couple pages worth of, I don't know how many column inches of type that you had every Sunday, but on Sunday morning on the big newspaper for the week, the largest circulated newspaper for the week, he had 2 full pages of fishing reports, stories about hunting, camping, fishing, outdoor recreation. And in Michigan, you know, I think at one time it used to have the moniker for their tourism was the sportsman state or something like that. Yeah. So Michigan is prime grade A #1 habitat and the location for hunting and fishing. You know, as any place in the eastern United States is as good as any place. But my father also wrote for Outdoor Life and Field and Stream magazines for 25, 30 years, finishing up a stint with Outdoor Life as a sports vehicle editor in Detroit. And he was also, there was a magazine that Chevrolet put out called Chevrolet Outdoors, and I think that was a quarterly, or was that a monthly? But you were the hunting editor for that, yeah. And then, of course, you also freelanced, which meant you were a gun for hire as a writer, and you were hired and you wrote for probably a vast majority of the main outdoor magazines and regional magazines that are out there that dealt with hunting and fishing. But you also wrote for monthly periodicals like National Geographic. I can remember when you got that job and it paid you $1 a word. And I remember as a kid that resonated with me. I was like, man, how many words are you going to write? 4,000 or 5,000? So, but of course, when my dad was writing all this stuff back in the late 60s and early 70s, he'd made some films. And when he wasn't in the office, I used to sneak down in the back room, and there was all these reels of 16 millimeter prints, film. And there was an old projector in there, and I would go ahead and load up that film in the projector and play it, and I'd watch these guys catching big fish and float planes buzzing cameras and on the surface of the water, and it just looked really cool to me. And I think that was probably one of the reasons that pushed me into filmmaking. I was impressed at an early age. But one of the things I watched my father over the years, especially when I was in my junior high and high school years, my father, being in the position where he was with the newspaper in Detroit, he had a real serious active role in wildlife conservation issues and the management of wildlife and habitat, and as far as how the Michigan Department of Natural Resources handled that. And Dad, you took on governors, you took on the Fish and Game Commissions, you took on a lot of people. You took on different groups, all in the name of doing what you thought was right for wildlife and wildlife habitat. Why did you do all that stuff?
I loved it. That's the shortest way to say it. I love being in that, being immersed in that mentally on various things. But from the standpoint of Michigan, you probably have to remember that Michigan's biggest income producer, of course, was car making back then. But its second biggest, with not everybody didn't know it back then, they know now, its second biggest income producer was tourism. And about 90% of the tourism coming into Michigan was aimed toward outdoor subjects, camping, hunting, fishing, whatever, canoeing, on and on it goes, snowmobiles. And so it was not only fun, and you not only cover it from the standpoint of how to, when to, what a great place, yada, yada, yada. I felt you should keep abreast of the issues some of them political, that affect all your readers. You have to remember the biggest single tourism event every year in Michigan was the opening day of deer season. More people involved in something than in anything else.
I think it's 1 million back in the day. I don't know what it is today, but 1 million people were hitting the trails and hitting the woods on that day.
Yeah, I can't remember what a real figure is because it's too far back, but it was a lot of folks. And when we got into issues involving management of streams or lakes or certain wildlife or all that, a lot of these things were political, and they ended up in the state legislature. So as a consequence, I was making political judgments here and there, and needless to say, some of mine didn't exist with politicians and all the usual ensued, but I got to know several governors that were involved in this, and then of course at that time, Michigan had a Department of Natural Resources that were governed completely by a civilian conservation group. All of those were appointed by the governor. And there was a specific term, but a great many of them on there when I covered it had been there for several years. I had the pleasure of becoming personal friends with a lot of them, and we hunted and fished together, and those particular activities kind of draw souls together, you know. And you find a guy that feels like you do about something you love to do. It's pretty rare if you don't end up as friends somewhere. So I had pretty good inroads to the management themes there, and I felt sportsman, I felt really strong. The sportsmen should pay attention to all this shit, pardon me, because it affected everything they did for recreation of the things they loved, or it could. Well, there were a number of sportsmen in Michigan who were that way. There was a blanket organization for all the county and local sportsmen's clubs in the world called Michigan United Conservation Clubs. It was big, and it was a powerful lobbying group at times. And I had a lot of things to do with them and with their executive directors and with their publications people. And it was a lot of fun at that time, at all times.
Yeah. You know, I remember there was a certain governor, a Democrat governor in Michigan named Jim Blanchard. And I remember hearing stories when I was growing up as a kid that it seemed like Governor Blanchard was intent in politicizing the Fish and Game Commission. And I remember you went toe-to-toe with him on that. And if I recall, I think you kept the politics out of conservation there in Michigan for a while.
As best I could.
What happened then?
As I'm one voice in the wilderness, but he came in following a long governorship of a guy named Bill Milliken, a Republican from Traverse City. And while Bill and I were never personal friends, he's one of the politicians I've met in this life that I think is the epitome of what a state politician should be. And he had, he named people to this commission, so he had an inroad. They had a chance to talk to him anytime they wanted. Well, when Blanchard came on, Democrat, he didn't enjoy all that. He had to work hard to win the governorship, which he did. But I just felt he didn't have a real grasp of what would happen if various routes were followed for doing all that. And I remember one time he wanted me to go have lunch with him, and his police protector guy, and he and I went down to some local restaurant in Lansing, and he was a very personable guy, nice guy. But he started to tell me about what he thought ought to be done in conservation and where the state should help out and do it. And several ideas he had were really decent. Unfortunately, several ideas he had were terrible. And of course, by the time he heard me tell him how terrible they were, we didn't go to any more luncheons after that. He didn't really push that hard against the Natural Resources Commission, because that commission had the trust of the legislature, state legislature, and of the sportsmen in the state. And anytime they got in a fight with somebody else politically, they had a lot of voices behind them, thank God. To tell you the truth, all that now has deteriorated into a somewhat less favorable system. And I left a long time ago, and I don't mean that I was at all singly responsible for anything, but they've had some governors since and some legislators since that have politicized certain things, and none of it has been for the good. So,
for the good of wildlife.
Good of wildlife, yeah.
You know, one of the other issues you dealt with real strongly is, you know, obviously you gave me a love for fly fishing for trout. Grew up fishing the Au Sable, the main branch, the Holy Waters. We ended up having a little place to call our little fishing lodge across the stream from Gould's Pool, which was where Trout Unlimited was commemorated and started, and you were there when that happened. But you took a real strong approach to fishing regulations on the Au Sable River, and it certainly didn't leave you in a lot of, especially with the folks around Grayling, weren't real happy with you, the local fishermen there. What happened?
Well, of course, the flies only regulations on the mainstream and several other streams there, the North Branch and the South Branch of the Au Sable on the mainstream, I think were in place when I came to Michigan. And I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure they were. Obviously, I supported them. But after 4 or 5 years, there were a bunch of fellows on the river. Some of them lived there, and I've come to know them, and we were friends. And several of them said, you know, this is a nursery area for trout. And that's why they go out there and they catch these 4 and 5 inch trout, because a trout stream's area is only going to support so many pounds of trout, because that's the habitat and that's the availability. And they said, what we really need to do is make this catch and release, so none of the fish get killed. Well, I and others suggested that. I did, and of course the newspaper. And there were a lot of trout fishermen who visited the Au Sable were not happy with that, because they like going up and killing a bunch of fish and taking them home, which, you know, at a certain time in history was what it was there for. But we went through this, and we tried to get certain groups get to it. In fact, one of the groups that really disliked us and worked against us was the Trout Unlimited chapter in the town of Grayling, through which the mainstream flowed. And a great many of those guys were in the trout guide business, and they felt that if they couldn't let their friends take fish home, their business would die. And I said, well, it's going to take some time, but if you let this go for a few years until you have an average of a 10, 11, 12, 14 inch trout, instead of one that's 3 inches to 6 inches, it's going to benefit your business like you can't believe. Well, and I told him, I said, even then, it could be 6, 8 years, maybe 10 years before that occurs with the stream. Well, some of these groups printed ads in the local papers, sort of berating me and telling them, I don't even know all that, but some of them were very funny.
Well, I mean, you were able to use your position at the Free Press, you know, on Sundays to write columns, editorials every Sunday.
Yeah.
And you were able to editorialize this, and, you know, your editors gave you the leeway because of the experience and knowledge you had to talk about, you know, how the fact is that, you know, this river, it is a diamond. It is absolutely one of the precious resource
you don't get anywhere.
Yeah, and it just really isn't replicated all over the place.
And the quote I love to quote during those things, and I'm trying to think of the guy. Who was the guy that white-haired guy that he didn't live in the Grayling area, but he was well known. I can't.
Morton F.
No, he's nationally.
Oh.
And he didn't necessarily get into the Au Sable battle, but he said something once that I thought was key. And he said, you know, a good trout's too valuable to be caught only once. And they'd proved that if they had no-kill in areas, catch and release or no-kill, that these fish might be caught by good fly fishermen 3, 4, maybe 5 times over 2 or 3 years. And they provided that much recreation instead of being caught at 8 inches and having their throat cut. Now, I still believe that. I've believed it all my life. You may not like it, but population dynamics are what they are. And you may notice through this talk that I'm talking about things like population dynamics and other things. And That was definitely, of course, what the biologists talked to in this. And I think that's what the hunters are talking these days, in these things, to make sure that the resource is preserved and enhanced and all that sort of thing. Whereas the anti-hunters, anti-fishermen, anti-blood sports people, they pretty much come out of the Walt Disney School of Bambi. And they think about the individual Bambi instead of thinking about the herd dynamics to survive. Sorry, I mean, it's understandable, but most of what Walt Disney put nature-wise on film, if you looked at the entire program of film, probably weren't very correct. They're trying to tell you what bears need or what deer need or how much fun it is, but they simply just ignored the real problems in there.
Well, we definitely want to talk about that a little bit later on in this podcast. Back in Michigan and back on the ensemble, you had a good buddy you liked to go fly fishing with. It was kind of an icon in the archery industry.
Fred Bear.
Yeah, Fred Bear.
You thought he's a good bowman. You ought to see him cast a fly when he was alive. Certainly. Yeah, we used to get together a couple of times during the season, and we'd fish out of various places on the mainstream. Fred actually had his factory on the mainstream, but above Grayling. It really wasn't, there were trout in there, but it wasn't like what we used to call the holy water. And I had met him through obvious things in the past, and we hit it off, and I really liked that guy. And if you saw him cast and watch him, he was a master at handling that fly line. But Fred left there because of political and financial problems, and his company thrives today.
Yeah, it's down in Florida now. So,
Yeah.
But and I had the special honor of my very first bow hunting season, the eve of my first morning on a bow hunt. We hung out at Fred Boyer's place there in Roscommon, I think is where it was. And
Just south of Roscommon.
Yeah, and spent the evening with
south of Mayo, really.
South of Mayo, and spent the evening with Fred, Mr. Bear, and I remember him telling us all those stories. Still have the pictures in my photo album, but that was a real special treat, and certainly something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And speaking of that, there's other people that we hung out with when I was growing up as a kid. There's the Motor City rock and roller that a lot of people see with the NRA, and he's got a TV show. He's been on outdoor television forever, but Ted Nugent was another one of your cohorts there for a while. You guys used to hang out doing stuff back. He was a little more, a little quieter, I think, back then. That's what I recall. I don't remember quite the.
He's gone through many years of honing his experience and what he wants to say, and he's not afraid at all to say almost anything about it. So he's fun to watch.
Well, how did you and Fred act? I mean, not you, Fred. How you and Ted end up becoming friends?
I think we had some mutual friends, and we were off somewhere during hunting season, and I went to visit their place. He had a place up by Baldwin for deer hunting. And we met, and we got to talking, and we hit it off pretty good. I mean, they called him the Motor City Madman, but he was really strange for the rock world. If you used narcotics, you wouldn't work for him. He wouldn't let you. You're gone. And he drank, but he was very careful. And around that time, that was unusual for somebody in that business to feel that way. And he and I went out a couple of times. Then he met you boys, and he wanted you to come along. So we'd go duck hunting on his farm or whatever.
Down in Jackson County. Yeah.
He's a nice guy. I don't frankly disagree with too many of the philosophical things he says about hunting and fishing, but he has a little more bombastic style in the way he says it. So.
Yeah, that would be an understatement. Yeah. So, well, Dad, I mean, conservation is a really big part of society today. And of course, you've had a chance to travel all over the world. You've spent extensive time in Africa. You've been in Russia, Siberia, Kamchatka. I mean, you've been in New Zealand, Australia. I mean, you've been all over the place, and all over Europe too, and South America. I mean, you've spent a ton of time in South America. I mean, a lot has changed. What do you see changing with wildlife conservation today?
Are you speaking of Argentina? Or are you
Well, I just
speaking of
in
South
general, just kind of I mean, obviously in Africa, the human populations have just literally blossomed, and I mean, not necessarily blossomed, they've exploded. Wildlife habitats literally being decimated. It's being converted into farm and cattle grazing grounds, sheep grazing grounds. What, from your perspective of watching this North American wildlife conservation model that you reported on, that you wrote about in the 1960s on through the 90s, what have you, I mean, if you were to surmise what you've seen happen over the last 50, 60 years, what's happened to wildlife?
Well, it's been the victim of bad press at times, and press that wasn't really true, wasn't accurate. They always told you how Africa was bare. And there have been problems in Africa, no doubt about it, particularly poaching and everything else. But a number of those countries have really worked hard to get hold of that. And they put out patrols and all this stuff in wildlife areas in the attempt to stop any poaching, stop any sport hunters who aren't going according to the rules.
Yeah, licensed, yeah.
Licensed. And I think I could tell you from a long time ago, there are no species, in southern Africa at least, that are endangered because of modern sport hunting. The guys that are poaching are the guys that are killing for meat and, what they call a venison hunt over there. You're never going to reach them through anybody but the police or the military. Or the game wardens. I mean, nobody else is going to spend the time. But you hear these things, these so-called experts here in the United States and England and everywhere else, that Africa's on its knees. The wildlife across there is just dying off. It's going to be gone. That's not entirely wrong. But it's certainly wrong for the vast majority of countries and animal species that are there today. When I first went, I thought, boy, I'm going to see some really unhappy things. And through the years, I learned that Africa is still the biggest bang for the buck in big game hunting. And it's incredible what, only the governments that have pitched onto this problem got their poaching stopped, but also for private individuals, through the fact that they love to watch these animals, or that they start into a preserve operation which enhances the animals, but it's used in a way that wildlife, and they think this is the only way it's going to make it in the future, wildlife actually pays its way, either through camping, photography, hunting, whatever you mention that can affect that population. They're starting to do that. And some of them quite rigorously, and some of them aren't cutting the meat because, by and large, the poachers are backed up by some of the higher government officials.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt that
they keep that well hidden.
Yeah, the corruption in Africa. No, how corruption anywhere it exists, and the reality we're seeing. I mean, look at Kenya. Kenya stopped, what we call, sport hunting or recreational hunting, in 1974, and their wildlife population today is plummeted by 70-80%. I mean, and that's from the experts. That's not hearsay.
The first line of defense for wildlife anywhere in Africa is the professional hunter, who has a certain geographical area he works. And if the poachers take all that, or it dies off from stupid management of resources, he's lost his income immediately. Now, who do you think would be more in favor of watching the wildlife become stronger in an area?
Yeah, I mean, take an analogy of of your rancher. Your rancher in the Midwest and Nebraska doesn't want to kill off all of his grass so his cows can't survive.
Yep.
And he's got to have a certain number of cows reproduce so that he has offspring for the next year, or offspring to sell. So he's got to make sure his cows are healthy. So he takes care of them. He takes care of the resource. He takes care of the animals. And at the end of the day, those animals are going to continue to propagate. They're going to continue to be healthy. And that will exist as long as those animals have a value to that rancher, farmer, or in your case, talking about professional hunters in Africa. And the same thing goes here in North America. I mean, the founding fathers were smart enough to make sure that our wildlife was an asset for all the people, all the citizens of the United States. And then, of course, President Theodore Roosevelt was keen enough to go ahead and enact our North American wildlife conservation model, which really gave strong value to the wildlife, but also came up with a funding apparatus. And the Pittman-Robertson Act in the 1930s, that added a whole bunch more to it. Well, and, according to the IUCN, there's only 2 places in the entire world that wildlife it's either holding its own or growing in size, and that's North America and Southern Africa. And that's because of that value you talk about.
Well, Teddy did something, and he used to come out and hunt a lot for recreation in eastern Wyoming. When it looked like he was going to quit that, he suggested that it be turned into a national park because of the wildlife value there and the geysers and all the other natural things. So the American Congress created Yellowstone National Park. You want to know what the first national park was in the world? Kruger in South Africa, where the Afrikaners decided that should be set aside, and it was a big park. It's easily as big as Yellowstone, maybe bigger. And so those were the 1-2 punch into the start of this field. And hats off to all those guys who were politicians then who really wanted to carry this. And Teddy Roosevelt chief among, because it was very visible what he did for that. But those things have progressed a hell of a distance from the start to this point today.
Yeah, they have. Unfortunately, in this day and age, because of that huge population explosion, people are pushing now up on like Kruger National Park. Yeah, it does have some outlying concessions that are for photography and or sustainable utilization, hunting, but the pressure's on, and the pressure's on all over the place. The politics have factored into Botswana. They banned hunting. Whether they got to come back. I mean, matter of fact, Kenya's now talking about maybe their parliament's been floating, their legislators are floating the idea that maybe we need to bring hunting back because we're going to have those people out there that care about the wildlife and make sure that they propagate and they're healthy.
An interesting tale about Botswana. I was in Gaborone one time waiting to take some hunters out to the bush, and I was sitting in a bar having a beer, and there was a guy who sat down beside me, kind of grizzled, old white guy, and he had a uniform on. Turned out he was a game warden for them. And we got to talking about the ban on shooting elephants that they'd brought on not too many years before that. And I had been out in the elephant areas in Botswana, and I'm here to tell you.
And this would have been the 1990s.
Yeah, probably, yeah, 1990s. I can tell you, there was no lack of elephants. I mean, there. And one of the things you get, well, anyway, he told me, commiserated about managing elephants, how difficult it was with all this legislation. And he made a statement to me that I said, what? He said, right now, after was 8 or 10 years of banning elephants, he said, to get the elephants in line with the available habitat that exists out there today, we need to cull shoot 17,000 elephants. I thought, what? He went and explained for an hour or two there at the bar what had happened. And later on that week, I was out driving up to a camp through an area in the western not Banguelo, but what's the big swamp?
You're talking about Okavango.
Okavango. We were driving up there, and we crossed an area where I had game hunts, I don't know, 4 years before, maybe, and where the tent sites were, the camps we had, and the water that ran all over, and at that time, elephants were everywhere. And the ecosystem could handle it, and it was working great and all that. And we drove through this thing, and it looked like a moonscape. The elephants had ruined it completely as they multiply.
And I've seen that too, and that's localized areas where the elephants are literally just denuded the vegetation. The ground has alkaline seeping up in there, so it's like a white dustpan area. Yep. There's no grass. There's a few shrubs that are straggling here, and the trees are all just dead, like skeletons.
Yeah.
It's like walking into a graveyard that hasn't been that's been painted with acid.
We were driving to another camp up north, and we went through mile after mile after mile of this destitute veldt there that it was dry. It was serious. I mean, the sage grouse were gone. Everything else you found there that made it what it was, they're all gone. That's because somebody talked them in to stopping elephant hunting. Now they've gone back several years ago.
And then they went ahead and canceled it again here about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's and all because of politics.
Yep.
Now, that was an anti-hunter that got tied in with, I won't name names here, but got tied in with the past president of Botswana and talked him into banning elephant hunting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all under the, that they were going to save elephants, which we all know that, elephants, any of these wildlife animals, they have to have a carrying capacity to live in. They have to have habitat, and that habitat will only hold so many animals. And once you surpass that number, then the animals are, and this is one thing that I've noticed here in all my research, Dad, is that prior to that North American wildlife conservation model, to any conservation by humans, wildlife populations historically had boom and bust cycles. So literally, if you looked at the graph, it had these huge spikes with all the prey animals, and the predators followed them. And then when there got to be too many animals that could, live, they have a die-off. It'd either be because of drought, could be disease, and you have this huge crash. And of course, the predators crash with them. And then they have, 8-10 years later, they come back up, and then they go away. Huge there. And what I think, we've done is, as modern conservation, wildlife conservationists, is we've taken those big, huge crashes, those big waves out, and we have much more of a even line. Where it stays fairly level, little dips here and there. And talking about Botswana, that brings me to mind, there's a bunch of books that you gave me by a very famous author on African hunting that he wrote to you and signed to you, wrote a little note to you, and I've got a collector's edition you gave to me. A fellow that was a bartender in Mon.
No, I actually was a bartender in Nairobi.
Oh, was he in Nairobi? Okay, all right, let's get that straight. So, how in the world did you meet Peter Capstick, and tell me about that relationship?
Well, he'd written his first book called Death in the Long Grass, and it was about lion hunting and problems that they include. And he portrayed them in the book that they were all personal experiences. He had been a bartender at this famous bar in Nairobi, whose name I forget, and the people that didn't like him very well claimed that he heard hunters talking about us, and that's where he got his tales. I wasn't sure that I agreed with that, but he used a bit of hyperbole in the thing, and it was kind of overdone here and there. Not so much in Death in the Long Grass. I was fascinated by the book because publishers would send me various books if I'd think about reviewing them. Oh, I finally got around an empty center, and I wanted to write a review on Death in the Long Grass. And so I did, and I included some comments that
can you just? Yeah, you could just. Okay, and I'll be done in 5 minutes, please. Fuck. It's always something around here. She's beating meat. So.
What were you talking about?
So we were talking about you were doing this review on the book.
Yeah. And I put a lot of things in there that weren't detrimental, but they were, not singing his praise, but I sung the praise of the book. And he was living in Naples, Florida then. Evidently had a clip service on that. And I said in the end of the column, I said, there's all these tales about Peter and all these sort of things. Some people make fun of him, but he says, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best African writing since Rook. And that was I was sitting at home about 2 weeks later and the phone rang. And here's Master Peter himself saying, commenting on the column, and he said, that's a really honest deal. I said, even the bad parts are honest. I said, well, I tried to tell him, but I really didn't have anything other than hearsay about these things. But they tended to kind of fill out the story to the advantage of Peter. Well, the next time I went to OW, Authorized American Convention, here's Peter that showed up. He'd got a membership in it, even though he was writing novels and all other kind of things, and not the things that the other writers were writing about in magazines. And we sat there and talked for a while and all that. And, that grew into kind of a meager exchange of letters or something for several years.
This is long before the days of email.
Oh, yeah. And I just liked his style. I mean, yes, he's bombastic and he maybe didn't have all his experiences. How the hell would I know, you know? But his description, his writing of this, of course, he used to be a movie promotion screenwriter.
Yeah.
So he had a pretty good background. And I liked the way he wrote. So I evidently said that in one column. I reviewed a few other of his books as they went by. And one day this box shows up from the publisher, and I open it up, and they're all of Peter's books. They've all been signed by him, and added a few comments on each one. And I mean, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but I was pleased he felt that way. Because, you know, my opinion is, well, people may say this about him, but I've been there, folks, and it's the gospel. So.
That's great. You know, Dad, we're running out of time here for this podcast, and definitely we'll have to pick up. There's obviously a whole wealth of information and an entire lifetime.
You and I could go on forever, man. Just
well, we could talk about a lot of things.
Ourselves.
Absolutely. So,
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.